Welcome to another episode of Reflections on Water. I'm Anna Wildeman. Dave and I had the great pleasure of sitting down with Iowa's Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Naig, to talk soil health, creative financing, and the sea of opportunities that lie ahead for Iowa in pursuing its water quality improvement goals. We also talked about the state's ongoing work as part of the Hypoxia Task Force. The task force is a partnership of federal and state agencies dedicated to addressing the sources of eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico, and that includes nutrient contributions from the vast Mississippi River Basin. Since we didn't get to it in the interview, I wanted to take a moment here and give a shout out to those career federal and state employees without whom the wheels would fall off of the Hypoxia Task Force. I know this because I've seen it, but every time a person like Mike Naig or Dave Ross declare during a task force meeting that they want to initiate something new or accomplish something in particular, you will see 3 or 4 or 5 federal or state agency folks make eye contact across the room. Their first reaction is, what are they talking about? And their second reaction is, how do we get it done? Those folks do great work every day. So thank you to all the Matts and the Katies and the Toms that keep the task force on task. I think you'll enjoy this interview, so let's get it underway. Secretary Naig, welcome to the podcast.
Great to join you guys. I'm excited to talk about a really important issue in the state of Iowa and for the country, and talk all about water.
Oh, thanks, Mike. It's great to see you again. When we met, you and I were serving as co-chairs of the Hypoxia Task Force.
That's right.
Which was, right. It was this great collaborative between the states along the Mississippi River, federal government, the federal partners. And somehow they trusted you and I to run it for a while. I want to start the conversation. Iowa's coming up, I think, on its 10-year anniversary of your nutrient reduction strategy. And while the goals have stayed the same about, protecting the Gulf and reducing the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to the Gulf, the approaches are different. So can you give us a little, status report where you are on the nutrient reduction strategy, where the state of Iowa is?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first thing I'll say, there's so much benefit in the states getting together to share ideas and work together on projects, but then to have that opportunity to meet with the federal family, to be able to, as you and I did many times throughout those years, to be able to raise an issue and say, you know what, but for this issue, we'd be doing more. Or, hey, as we are scaling up our efforts in the state of Iowa to do this, hey, we ran into this barrier, and what can we do? And then, there was an effort to then bring the federal partners to the table and say, all right, let's dig into this. And so I always appreciated the fact that from a information sharing standpoint, it's a great venue, but we took it to the next level, which is, all right, now that we've identified challenges, let's go attack them. Let's go try to bring some solutions. And so that's something I always appreciated about that interaction that we continue to have today, that has now spanned a couple of administrations, and we continue to have strong engagement and support for that task force process. You mentioned our nutrient reduction strategy in Iowa. We launched it in 2013, and so we're coming up, hard to believe, on a 10th anniversary soon. And so we're thinking a lot about looking back and trying to, we're gonna really talk about what's happened in that amount of time, what have we accomplished, but really we're going to use it as a launching pad for what about the next 10, and what do we hope to accomplish, and how are we accelerating, and how are we innovating. I always like to bring up the fact that even since we finalized our strategy in Iowa, we've added new practices that weren't even thought of at the time. Bioreactors and saturated buffers are 2 things that we're doing at the edge of the field, and they weren't in the initial strategy because they didn't exist at the time. There's just one little example of innovation. And then I guess the other point to make is every state is dramatically different in the landscape, in the resources that they can bring, the way the agriculture fits, the urban and rural components of a state, the industry, all of those things are different. And so it is so important that states have unique nutrient reduction strategies that address the challenges in their states. And So I love to see that work that's been going on over the last few years as those strategies have come to fruition. And now you've got states really focused on implementing those strategies.
Is that going to be your focus, the next iteration, the next decade? Why don't you give us a little bit of window into what you're thinking about as sort of key elements in your strategy going forward?
It's interesting. As I think back, I was the deputy secretary at the time. My predecessor, Bill Northey, was the Iowa Secretary of Agriculture. He had previously served as co-chair of the task force and then went to the federal side, right, as a USDA undersecretary. So he had experience on both sides of that equation. But I can remember when we first launched the strategy that we spent a significant amount of time just flat out telling people we have a strategy, here's what's in it, and gosh, we ought to work on it, and that really was the way we started the first couple of years. And in the last couple of years, we have been exclusively focused on scaling up, right? We say we know what to do. The science tells us that these particular practices, cover crops, wetlands, traditional conservation practices, they're the practices that result in water quality improvement. So we got to go out and do more of them. Well, so then how do you do that? How do you scale up? How do you build the capacity to do that? How do you address permitting issues that might come up around wetlands? And that will really, I think, be the focus for the next 10 is continuing to scale up. And then how do we get creative in how do we finance those projects, right? There's a place for and a great need for cost share in the traditional sense that we've always done conservation work, but there's got to be more, right? We've got to either identify those benefits that are out there that have a return on that investment, or are there some markets that can develop that can help us pay for and see more implementation?
I'm glad you raised that, Mike, because, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that financing piece. What kind of creative financing is the state looking at? You just mentioned, maybe some markets, maybe some return on investment, but, are you looking at the infrastructure bill? Are you looking hard at those environmental markets that are really still sort of in development in a lot of places?
Absolutely. And I know your history on this and your background, the work that you put into this in particular, both of you, and really trying to figure this out, right? That these are largely undeveloped at this point, right? I mean, we still haven't quite seen how this works at scale, but I do think that there is a market, there can be a market driving some of this. So a couple different ways, we're exploring the urban and rural, the point and non-point connection here. What can a city or an industry do to satisfy some of their permit requirements by investing in the non-point source practices, and is there a credit type situation there that can develop? Certainly around, everybody's talking in the ag space about carbon. Everywhere you go, there's how many podcasts and how many articles about carbon. I tend to think carbon's really the next iteration of talking about sustainability in ag, right? And carbon's a way to talk about it and think about it. We've actually been funding a couple of projects here. We'll call them demonstration scale, but they're starting to get bigger in scale. But trying to look at that, hey, can we invest in practices that have a nexus between nutrient reduction, building soil health, and sequestering carbon? Now, the carbon might be the item that has value today, but we're still getting the nutrient reduction that we're looking for. And so we're really exploring some of those systems or those markets, and then how do you value all of that? Those are the big questions that we're looking at. But I have to say, I'm really excited about this. Is a disruptive thing, right? This is something that I think we'll all be talking about in the next couple of years, and I'm really interested in what this can mean from trying to get more work done on the ground.
Yeah, so you mentioned carbon, the nutrient reduction, and soil health. And particularly inside the Beltway, or as people talk about just global reduction in the nitrogen, phosphorus outputs into the watersheds or into the carbon sequestration. But I think what gets lost is that soil health issue. And if you're not driving on soil health, you're not driving on economics out on the landscape. So you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, spot on. You can't do any one thing, right? I mean, I how many times has somebody said, you just need to do this, or if you would just focus on this particular practice, or no, this has got to be holistic, right? And soil health is a great example of this, right? What is soil health? Well, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? We know that there's, building organic matter, that focusing on soil health means we're preventing soil erosion, and we have better infiltration of water. And ultimately, what this means is that ground can be even more productive, right? And at the end of all of this, a component of sustainability needs to continue to revolve around, is there profitability? Is there, can I continue to do what I'm doing this year, next year? Do I have an ongoing operation? And that productivity and profitability piece has got to be a part of it too. I think soil health is the right thing to be thinking about, and all that goes in it, right? It's not just carbon, but it's many things. And I think how do you define that? How do you measure that? And then how do you talk about a return on investment of soil health over the long term? What does it do for me next year? What does it do for me in 10 years or 20 years? I think those are some of the big questions around soil health.
So I want to, you mentioned what's it going to do for me in, next year, 5 years, 20 years. That raises a thought in my brain as to, that validation, that measurement. As the state has committed to reductions in this space, how do you show the outside world that we're actually reductions that you guys are so heavily investing in?
Yeah, great question. And, we owe this to the taxpayer, right? And it's a judicious use, wise use of Iowa taxpayer dollars and the federal dollars that flow into the state of Iowa from a conservation implementation standpoint. We should be able to show progress, right? Or show what's happening with those dollars. We've really been committed to this in Iowa, and we're always trying to do it better too. We're always trying to innovate in how do we tell what's going on? How do we show Iowans in a way that they can easily understand and yet know that there's more behind that if they want to dig deeper and understand some of the details? And so what we've done is we've transitioned actually we used to have a lengthy, text-heavy report, 90-plus pages. I always said if you tucked it under your pillow at night, maybe you'd absorb some of it like we used to do in college. But at least you'd know that there was a lot of work that got done, but not many Iowans would sit down and read a 90-plus page document. Now, what we've transitioned to is we're trying to display progress in a dashboard form, something that is a quicker hit for folks, that they can see visually. Where are we at with practice adoption? Where are we at with engagement with farmers or farmer awareness? Or where are we at with spending dollars? And where are we at with leveraging state dollars? Those are great things. Those actually mean that those things mean something to an Iowan when they look at that dashboard. And then if you want to dig in behind that number and look at the detail, we also want to be able to provide that for them. So we think it's a good mix, and we're really excited about being able to launch these new dashboards, and hopefully more folks, can then follow along and see what the benefits of what we're doing.
That's really great to hear, Mike, because when you're talking about water and water quality and how agriculture interacts with it, it's not just about the watershed. When I hear you talk about it, it's really about communities and bringing communities together on this issue, really for the benefit of everyone. So having an effective way to communicate all of that, I think is great. And I'm so glad to hear you all have invested in that.
We've tried to partner with people. We partner with all kinds of folks. If this is just the ag world working on ag issues, and then we leave the urban space to the urban folks, and that's your set of issues, that doesn't work, because this is shared, right? We all live in a watershed. We're all together. We're all connected. When we're out talking with a farmer about a practice on the ground, we're not necessarily talking about the Gulf of Mexico, right? But it is connected, and if we're doing things right locally, we will have the impact that we know we need to see regionally and downstream. But we've also really worked hard to engage partners of all kinds. We've got several hundred partners in the state of Iowa who have joined us as part of our projects. Everything from cities to ag retailers, certainly ag businesses, to habitat groups, Ducks Unlimited and Pheasants Forever and others. And I love layering in all of those benefits of the urban space, maybe flood mitigation with habitat protection for birds or for pollinators. And of course, we're getting the soil conservation and the nutrient reduction benefits that we're looking for too. Isn't it great to be able to tie all that together? And I know you two have seen that, right? The way that you can layer these benefits in and then bring together all of the affected parties in a way that's, you can do something very, very productive there.
That partnership piece, I think, is key, particularly for the agriculture sector, right? You're the Secretary of Agriculture for a major agriculture state. And some of the narrative out there is, shouldn't agriculture be doing more? And there's just been this sort of tension between the point source, non-point source world, and getting, I think, the trust of what you're trying to accomplish out on the landscape. But how do you do that? How do you build that trust? You're talking about partnerships, but there's a trust piece here.
Oh, there is. I probably boil this down too simply sometimes, Dave, but I'll generally say we might get a group together and I'll say, now let's go do something together, right? We can talk about things. We can talk about things for years, but let's go do something together. Now that's hard. That can be hard, especially if you've never partnered with somebody before, and those are things where we'll often say, let's just get started. Let's do a project together. Let's link up. Let's announce what we're going to do and then go do something. And we got a couple examples here just recently that I think surprised a few folks, but we're proud of these partnerships. We just launched an effort to seed cover crops in central Iowa, and the partnership is with Polk County, so our largest county in Iowa, with Des Moines in the capital city in the middle of that. Heartland Co-op, one of our leading partners in conservation, one of our great producer-owned co-ops in the state of Iowa, and Des Moines Waterworks. So the largest drinking water utility in the state of Iowa. That relationship with agriculture has not always been positive. There's been some litigation in the past few years, and yet here we've arrived at a point where we're in a partnership together to get more cover crops seeded on the ground. I say it all the time. We will literally work with anybody who wants to, in good faith, go out and get more conservation done on the ground. So that's just one example where we've got the largest urban center in the state of Iowa partnering with agriculture to get cover crops on the ground, because we know that has a positive impact. We mean it. We'll work with anybody, but let's go do something together. Let's go build something together, and then let's measure the benefits. And that's something that all partners can be proud of.
Obviously there's more work to be done, and I know you believe that personally. Yeah. But how do you get that story out about all the work that you are doing in a way that the public understands it?
Well, first of all, you have to acknowledge that piece right there, which is I think sometimes we're afraid to say that, right? Which is, I am so proud of what we've done, and we have accomplished so much, and we've got a lot to do, right? We would not be as focused, certainly in the state of Iowa, as we are on this if we didn't think that there was work to do. And we understand those challenges that are out there. I find a lot of times folks are so focused on doing the work, right? They are so focused on doing the work, and we don't have time to stop and talk about it. But, the ability to show progress, the ability to explain why, how dollars are being spent or how partnerships came together, that is so critically important. So, in my role as the state co-chair for Task Force still today, I continue to try to highlight that. Whenever we have a meeting, we will kind of poll the group before and say, send me one thing, send me just one thing that you're proud of or that you're working on, and I'll highlight that. And so we try to extract those things out. I think we're getting better. We're getting there where we can say, look, there's so much importance in framing those up, telling those stories, and giving some examples to folks.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, because what I find so interesting about the task force itself is that, as you know, there are 13 state members, and we talked earlier about the federal partners' involvement. But some states are represented on the task force by their Department of Environment or their Department of Natural Resources. And other states like Iowa are represented by their Department of Agriculture. Can you talk about how this dynamic plays out in your state? Does it create challenges between the two agencies, or does it drive partnerships?
That's a great question, and it's a great observation about the task force, right? And again, I'm the state co-chair here, so what I'm going to say is every state's a little different, aren't they? And they've got their unique situations and challenges to work through, and we respect that. In fact, we want to support states in their unique circumstances. I really can only speak to Iowa's experience, right? So I will always say that there are really two components to that strategy that have been so important to us. I've shared this with many other states and other folks. The first is that our strategy is built on science. We had a first of its kind science assessment that looked at the types of practices that we wanted to go implement. Again, things like cover crops and buffer strips and wetlands, no-till, and assigned a nutrient reduction to that practice based on the best science. So I know that when we go out and invest in a practice like that, that the science supports that that's worth, there's value there, that's worth the investment. And I tell you what, having that foundation, that underpinning is so important, and it's really been one of the key drivers for us. And it's allowed us to attract a lot of support for the strategy, funding and public support for it. And it gives confidence to the farmers and landowners that we're working with that this is meaningful work. Okay, so that's number one. Two is that we didn't just develop an ag strategy or an urban strategy or a point source strategy, that we work together. The three principles of Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy are the Iowa Department of Agriculture with the leadership role for non-point, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources with the leadership role for point source, and then Iowa State University. And they are really the again, that scientific foundation, and they house the measurements, right? We wanted that kind of third party, somebody with credentials, so to speak, those academic credentials to say, here's what's happening, and we can report that out from a measurement standpoint. And so for us, it's been seamless. I can remember sitting at task force meetings where, maybe states weren't necessarily getting along between or talking seamlessly between agencies. And here we were all sitting together, and people would kind of go, well, why does that happen? Well, we work together all the time. We meet regularly. And that's been a strength, I think. Now, does everything always go just perfectly? Are we always of one mind? No, but we've got a framework to work through those things. That's what's important.
So as we think about the future and where the state of Iowa is going to go on this journey, what do you think are your biggest impediments to success in implementing your strategy? At the state level, and then of course, and how that relates to the overall Hypoxia Task Force. But just at the state level, what are the number one impediments do you see?
Yeah, I'd say there's threefold. One is funding. The second would be around capacity, just capacity to deliver practices, the technical assistance. And three, I've got some concerns about regulatory impediments that could get in our way and drive up costs. So funding. Let's start with that, right? Again, I talked about how we've had a traditional cost share model, but how do we move to either, again, showing return on investment because of benefits that you accrue over time, or because there's a market that develops that values credits that we're pushing, or, that there's some other way to be able to bring financing to this that allows us to scale up. Two, the people, it's still a people business. Now, we've never had the mentality that every person that's out selling conservation or working on conservation in the state of Iowa needs to be a Department of Ag employee, right? In fact, quite the opposite. We need lots of private sector partners and non-governmental organizations to be able to help us. And so again, we've developed some great, Ducks Unlimited is a great partnership that I like to talk about, where we're actually working with them. They're doing some of the design work on wetlands that we're building. Well, why would they do that? Well, you've got waterfowl habitat that's developed, and they get that, and we pair that up with nutrient reduction. Well, if they weren't doing that, we would have to either hire engineers in-house, or we'd have to be contracting with that some other way. So just one example, but how do we build capacity outside of the walls of government in the private sector that can do things very efficiently and be able to expand our reach? And then regulatory. We've got some permitting challenges. I think you're aware of these that can develop around wetlands. Here we are trying to improve water quality, the overall environment in this area, and we run into a permitting requirement in the name of, by the way, protecting water quality, right? Those are things that are very, very frustrating to us because they get in our way, they drive up the cost. I've got a list of wetlands that that we'd like to build in the state of Iowa, that some of them require permitting. And so we've had to set those aside. We've had to put those on a shelf and go find other sites because of the length of time and the cost that it takes to build those under a permit situation is just, we can't afford to at this time. And so Those are some of the challenges that we look at. But I always come back to this point. I am so thankful that we are talking about those types of things that are challenging us, because every one of those things is only an issue because we're expanding what we're doing, because we're accelerating what we're doing, because we're trying to be innovative in what we're doing. If we were just sitting back doing what we've been doing for how long and never changing anything or never growing, we wouldn't have these growing pains. That's what they are. They're growing pains, and we can work on them.
Mike, of course, there are always going to be impediments and barriers to progress, but probably the most important question I can ask you is, where do you see the most opportunity for the state of Iowa to continue making progress in water quality improvements, soil health, and sort of the range of issues we've talked about today?
Yeah, and we're, as I like to say, we're agriculture people, so we have to be optimists, right? We're coming up in the spring of the year. There's so much potential right now for this growing season, and that's the mentality I think we need to bring to this topic as well. Looking at the state of Iowa, our most important natural resources are soil and water, right? It is the basis of our productive agriculture. And the productive agriculture is the basis of our economy. So we have to be focused on that for the long run. So what do I think the greatest opportunity? It's this. I talked a little bit about it before, but the idea of how do we bring together this nexus of carbon and sustainability and environmental services and all of those pieces. How do we bring that together and make Iowa an even more competitive place for agriculture because of that? So we've got two real foundational pieces that we're very strong at today. One is around renewable energy. We lead the nation in ethanol and biodiesel production, but we also have strong solar and wind and renewable natural gas. There's a lot of potential here as we look to decarbonize our economy, as we look for lower carbon intensity scores for energy. We think Iowa's got a huge role and a huge competitive advantage here. And then the second piece is the foundation around conservation. All the work that we've done. I mean, we go back to the 70s in terms of the leadership role that we've had in the country in terms of soil conservation work that's gone on, and then with our nutrient reduction strategy starting in 2013. And again, how do you understand that nexus between soil health, soil conservation, water quality, carbon? And then what does that mean in terms of economic drivers and financial incentives and return on investment on our landscape? To me, that's some of the most exciting things that we can be thinking about. Oh, by the way, you can add a technology component into that too, right? Digital agriculture, precision agriculture, all those different tools that you start to bring this together. And I'm excited to think about 5, 10, 15 years from now about what are the practices that we're doing that we are just starting to think about today. That's the stuff that gets me excited, and that's the stuff that really drives our team to always be doing more. We're so proud of where we are, all the partnership and all the work. There's never been more work being done in the state of Iowa, more effort, more awareness, more practices being adopted, and we know that we're really just getting started, that there's so much more to do.
In this moment, with this opportunity in front of you, it takes vision and leadership. Anna and I really appreciated your vision and leadership, working when we were in our last jobs at EPA, working with you on the Hypoxia Task Force. It is important to have that strong state voice. So we appreciate that leadership. We appreciated it. Now I think Iowa's in good hands going forward. So thank you for what you did, in that relationship with the federal government and the Hypoxia Task Force. And thanks for joining us on the podcast. We've just greatly appreciated it.
Well, I've enjoyed this. It's great to see old friends and to, as I said at the beginning, to talk about some really important, some fun issues, right? Some issues that are meaningful, and we've got so much opportunity here to do even more. So thanks. Great to see you guys.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.